I really want to emphasize to you guys what a shocking moment this was to see these two powers agree to not mess with each other, because it really was sort of like the default mentality was that they were going to fight. And so when this happened, and we know in retrospect it's temporary, it's probable that Hitler had always intended to go into Russia after Poland, but hard to say for sure. But regardless, it's this action coupled with the invasion then of Poland that starts World War II. So what happens in the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, they actually agree that they'll carve up Poland. Both because we don't often mention it, but the Soviets invaded Eastern Poland at the time that the Germans invaded Western Poland. The Poles, they put up a valiant effort, but they still had biplanes, like two-wing planes, and Luftwaffe just sopped them up in one kind of afternoon. Yeah, and then enrolled the first generation of German tanks, or really the second generation. They've been toying with them. Right, that's right. So they had been updating them in the interwar period. They'd actually really developed tanks pretty well. So let's talk about how FDR and America responds to the invasion of Poland. Keep in mind that Britain and France, in the wake of the invasion of Poland, declare war on Germany. Like that was the line in the sand that was a bridge too far, And so what you have is a brand new law, which we're going to call the one Neutrality Act that you have to know by date. And that is the Neutrality Act of 1939, although nobody calls it that. What it's known as to everyone who ever identifies this period in history is cash and carry. So FDR gets a new Neutrality Act passed. And he says, look, before we were comfortable in a position where, the Germans were sort of doing their own thing. But now, under the old Neutrality Acts, we can't lend any money or guns or anything to the British or the French under those rules.
Right. So that tell them weapons, but you have to ship them yourselves.
That's right. So it's a modified version of that. Any country, which theoretically that would have included Germany, but the problem, of course, for Germany is they're blockaded. So Germany can't get here. So he basically says any country that can, travel through the danger zones can come to the United States and buy munitions. And this is, by the way, this is going to allow many American factories to start firing up, to start ending the depression, so to speak. So they're going to start manufacturing parts for airplanes, parts for tanks, machine guns here in America. But the condition is no loans. You got to pay in cash. And this is not going to be that helpful in the end because the European countries don't have that much money. However, they are going to shift what money they do have into purchasing war goods. So the Brits particularly are going to be able to come over here. And this, by the way, as I point out on my notes here, will end the so-called Roosevelt recession. If you understand, like this gets the government, the economy going again a little bit more. And we began seeing this term in print, and that is America is the arsenal of democracy, meaning we're not fighting, but we'll sell to the good guys who are fighting, so to speak, if they give us cash. And also, like I said, the Germans and the Italians, they don't come over here because they can't. So at this point, you would think maybe America would start revitalizing its military, right?
No.
They don't. And so I pulled another quote talking about the minuscule interwar army. No one should get more credit for it than a guy named George Marshall. He is going to be elevated to the command of the U.S. Army at this point. So this is when George Marshall becomes the chief of staff of the U.S. Army. And the military only has 174,000 people, which is not very big. And they're spread all over the world. And they're still, pulling cannons with horses. So not a modern army. And I don't want to fool you into thinking, well, let's now get modernized. This is the problem going into 1938 and 39, and now even into 1940. So after the invasion of Poland, World War II kind of takes an odd turn. So keep in mind, Poland put up a valiant resistance, but they only were able to hold off the Germans and the Soviets for about 30 days. And so by the end of September 1939, Poland has been conquered. Well, then what? Well, the problem is, of course, it's late fall and winter, and the Brits and the French are not prepared to fight. Hitler does not want to launch any major offensive in the winter of 1939-40. And so the expression is that the war then becomes the so-called phony war. It's like they started the war and then they don't fight each other. Yeah, they give each other ugly faces, right? Except I do want you to say, the joke is that it goes from blitzkrieg to sitzkrieg, right? Except I do want to point out that the Soviet Union will invade Finland during this period. So there is some fighting in the snow. Finland puts up a valiant resistance. But as soon as the Winter War ends in Finland, not as soon as the Winter War ends, but as soon as the winter ends, in spring of 1940, so it's right about this time of year, Hitler is going to launch an attack on Denmark. And, that was kind of like a surprise for a lot of people. And then from Denmark into Norway. Now, Churchill had actually warned, Churchill, by the way, this is Winston Churchill. He was out of office during this period. Now, Churchill belonged to the Conservative Party, the Tory Party, and he had a couple bad runs at leadership. He had kind of failed as Lord of the Admiralty. He'd failed as Chancellor of the Exchequer. And so he was out of office at the time. He was actually out of his country estate writing a huge biography of one of his ancestors, Lord Marlborough. And he was building a wall, like he was literally building a brick wall, in his garden. And Chamberlain has developed cancer. And more importantly, I guess, in the short term, Dr. Chamberlain, he is now seen as ineffective. Clearly, appeasement didn't work. And Churchill is warning, look, Hitler is going to start attacking countries as soon as the spring comes. And when Hitler does, there is a vote of no confidence by the Conservative Party, and Chamberlain is voted out as prime minister. Now, he's not out of the parliament, but he's no longer prime minister. And then they have a vote, and Churchill is elevated to the prime minister of the Conservative Party. And so that means he's the prime minister of parliament. And he will become the leader of Great Britain throughout all of World War II. So he's warning of this, and he understands the reason that the Germans want Norway is this jagged coastline right here. Every major war with Britain, the Germans get blockaded. Like any country that fights Britain gets blockaded. So what Hitler wants is these fjords, these coasts of Norway, for secret attack bases for his submarines, the wolf packs, and for medium-sized ships to be outside of the range of a blockade. Britain will send troops to Norway and ships, but it's kind of too little too late. The bulk of the British expeditionary force will be held back because they're concerned about an attack on Britain. So by the spring of 1940, Hitler has rolled up Denmark and Norway, and then he launches his attack westward. And I should relocate this here. I'll put Hitler here and the sad French guy crying below him. I've got a couple pictures in here I forgot about. So this picture that you're looking at right here in the middle is what becomes known in history as the Miracle at Dunkirk. There's been a really great movie made about it. And what happens is the British and the French prepare to defend France on the area where France was attacked in World War I. They expect that's where the attack will come. It does come through the Low Countries. It comes through Belgium and the Netherlands. The Belgians put up quite a bit of stiff resistance, but it's of no use because this is blitzkrieg at its fullest. He's just going to annihilate, he being Hitler's forces, the Belgians and the Dutch, and roll into the French. And at this point, the Brits are up here on the English Channel. I don't know if you guys can see this or not. Small town right here called Dunkirk. And the entire British force is at Dunkirk in France, and they get surrounded and cut off. One of the worst mistakes, that Hitler is about to make. So the British force is here on the coast of the English Channel to defend France, and they get cut off. And so now Hitler can eliminate or obliterate the entire British army in France. And so Churchill pulls one of the most remarkable stunts really ever in military history. He sends out a call to the Navy to get every commercial and passenger and civilian vessel in Britain to sail across the English Channel. And it's cloudy and rainy. And so Hitler has been holding off launching his attack on these, 500,000 Brits until he can utilize his Air Force well, right? And he's actually passed them. They actually overshot the Brits. And so this is a picture of the British Army being loaded into like sailing vessels. The entire British people who have ships or boats come to France, rescue them, and sail back across the English Channel. So by the time the Germans launch their attack on Dunkirk, there's no more British Army there. Now, it does require a British outpost at Calais to be utterly annihilated. They put up a really strong fight, and it's kind of like one of those desperate battles to hold on. And they're lost, a British unit down here. But the Brits are able to rescue basically their entire army, which is really, really good for the future, because otherwise we would miss a lot of our allies in D-Day. So nonetheless, in 4 weeks, Hitler takes over France. So from May of June into June of 1940, France is defeated. And this is an absolute nightmare scenario. It's an astonishing event in the West, to us, to America. We're sitting here thinking the last war was fought from 1914 to 1918 in France. This time, France fought for 4 weeks, not for over 4 years. And I will tell you, the French had tried to develop a resistance to the German invasion called the Maginot Line, and Hitler just goes around it. It's one of the most ineffective defensive positions ever built. And then France will be taken over. Now, there will actually be 2 Frances during World War II. From Paris, west and north will be directly occupied by the Germans. So that'll be like German-controlled territory with German leaders there. Southern France and the French Empire will be ruled by governed by a puppet government in Vichy France, it's called. And so what's really interesting to me is one of the battles that the very first battle in this theater of World War II that we fight is going to be in Morocco against French forces. We actually fight the French before we fight the Germans. So it's kind of weird. But nonetheless, once France is defeated, this scares the living daylights out of everybody in America, as you might imagine. And this kind of is the wake-up call to where FDR says we're going to have to start building up forces. We're going to have to start having a military, because we don't have one so far. And you'll see for the first time in American history, a draft during peacetime. Now, I know you're like, this doesn't sound very peacetimey, but we're not at war. America is not officially at war. And so it is a self-defense measure. That's right. FDR will then start pouring money, or Congress. Now, keep in mind, the entire New Deal costs about $20 billion. This 1 year of spending to prepare for World War II costs $37 billion, right? So military spending is an whole different category from domestic spending. I hope you understand that, right? And the last thing that's done, and it's an important step, is down in Cuba, we're going to meet with 20 other Latin American countries. And the concern is that these European powers like the Dutch and the English and the French had overseas colonies, that some of which were in Latin America. And we do not want the existing Latin American colonies to fall into the hands of the Nazis. So this is an agreement to all 21 countries will work together to uphold the Monroe Doctrine. It's the first time that ever happened, where like Latin American countries said, yeah, we're going to apply the Monroe Doctrine. And I would remind you of the good neighbor policy kind of laid the foundation for this. Like, they were much more trusting of FDR than, say, they would have been of TR or even Wilson. So at the same time that this is going on, Hitler is beginning to carry out what will ultimately become known in history as the Holocaust, right? Hitler had written about this in the 1920s and routinely talked about it, that there had to be something to do with the Jewish question. That's how he phrased it, the Jewish question. So initially, he will have laws that allow him to make blanket anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish laws in Germany. So the initial way that the Nazis kind of try to deal with the Jews is to make life in Germany so uncomfortable that these people will leave. They'll just become migrants and go somewhere else. But a whole lot of these people and their families have lived in Germany for like 3 and 4 generations, 5 generations. So nonetheless, the events of the Holocaust or the final solution are going to begin in earnest after Himmler, who's the head of the SS, and his supporters encouraged the German people to engage in massive vandalism, all right, which is called Kristallnacht. But before that, I asked, how is he drawing on anti-Semitism that was already there? So don't forget what anti-Semitism means: hatred of the Jews. And there are, multiple reasons why Europeans had these points of view, but some of the most obvious was Jewish people typically were fairly well off economically. Okay, there were a lot of Jewish families that were in banking, in business, in the arts. And I believe it's primarily because of their strong focus on education throughout all the history of Judaism at the synagogue. Secondly, they don't have a nation state. So they're perceived as, some critics call them the wandering Jew, right? This is the caricature of the wandering Jew. These two images, as well as this one, is the sort of famous global conspiracy of the so-called parasitic Jew, like the Jews are sucking the world of all its wealth. And the problem, of course, from Hitler's perspective, is they were the reason for the Depression. That's what he claimed. And so there was already enormous anti-Semitism in Europe. I have this up here. The Jews had always been called the Christ killers, which is ironic since Jesus was Jewish. But back in the 1200s in England, they had to wear yellow badges. They were hung in the Tower of London in the 1200s. Most recently, Tsar Alexander had forced the Jews into what were called the pogroms. The Spanish had persecuted it. So anti-Semitism was not something that Hitler invented. There was strong anti-Semitism in the country he grew up in, which was Austria, towards what are called Galician Jews, many of which were Hasidic, and so they were a different religious group. They often stuck close to each other, like insular. And Hitler would use that to scapegoat the Jews, to make them the sort of villain. He also was preaching the pseudoscience garbage, sort of social Darwinist called. He based it on the writings of a philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche, as well as, like I said, like the social Darwinist theories of the time. And that is that the German people were, if they were pure-blooded, his words, were the superior people in history. He co-opted the word Aryan from a group of people. So nonetheless, the Jews made for a very easy target. They had lots of money. There weren't very many of them. They gathered all in the same community. So that was pretty easy to target them, right? And his initial plan is to simply make them want to leave. And certainly some Jews did, perhaps most notably Einstein. When Einstein left Germany in 1933, he did not go back. All right. Yeah, right. Good move for our part and his, right? So nonetheless, he goes and becomes a professor at Princeton. And, Jews that kind of had means, like money, and had the understanding, and were not particularly nationalistic, left. All right. And a lot of millions of Jews did move out. The irony is they moved to places like Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, where they got taken over. Yeah. So when Hitler invaded those countries, he just invaded places where Jews were now. So that then makes 38 a turning point year. In 38, the SS has been created under the leadership of Himmler. He'll later create a group within the SS called the Einsatzgruppen, which were the guys who were like the death squads to kill the Jews. But the beginning is when they made it possible for ordinary German citizens to feel comfortable destroying Jewish property. So this would be like having radio broadcasts or newscasts basically saying, smash the Jewish windows. And that's exactly what happened. 7,000 businesses and synagogues throughout Germany get destroyed in what is called the Night of Crystal Glass Nacht Night. So this is the Night of Broken Glass. And that's the year that it really begins to become more towards the implementation of what's called the final solution. Now, within FDR's cabinet were several Jewish people, most notably the Secretary of the Treasury. Now, I haven't mentioned his name before, but the man who oversaw FDR's, many of his agenda was a man named Henry Morgenthau. And Morgenthau had been warning FDR about what was going. He had, he had friends in important places, obviously, and the word had gotten from Germany and from Europe, from both refugees, but also from just word of mouth. Like people had talked about that what was going on in Nazi Germany. But I want you to notice the date. Notice the date, right? Really, I should put this first because Jews assumed that if they came to America, they would be safer, right? Well, ultimately, yes, absolutely. They went, and this is not just the St. Louis, but this is an example, the best example, sort of the saddest example. But Jews wanted to do what Einstein had done, which is like become a refugee. But when the war starts, now the war is not even happened yet. But once the war really gets going, this is going to get even tighter by U.S. But before the war even started, many Jews started to try to come to America. Most notably here, the St. Louis, the SS St. Louis, and it sat outside the harbor in Miami for days. From what I've read about it, it was a very miserable experience. These people are crammed on a ship, and they're here in America waiting to get refugee status. In the end, FDR decides no, that it's too much tied into European issues. Like we don't want to get entangled, so they go back to France and unload in Belgium. And that's about the time that Hitler takes them over. So all of these folks are going to end up dead as a result of us not taking them in. Now, not because we killed them, but because we're basically going to assume a position of this is not our problem. We don't want a part of this. Isolationism. And like I said, many people within the cabinet and within the community around FDR were concerned, and they really wanted him to change policy. Most notably, I think, is during World War II, when we're bombing German cities and like, Dresden and places like that, there was a request by Jewish leaders who came and talked to FDR and said, please bomb the train lines that are going to the camps, even bomb the camps. And FDR talked about it with the high command of the army, and they decided these were not military targets. So they would use all the resources for military targets to end the war early. But we didn't target as policy the mechanism of the Holocaust, which is it's a tough choice. I'm sure it was. So, I want to remind you that if Einstein comes here in 1933, finally in 1944. So this is about a year before the end of the war. President Roosevelt creates a war refugee board, which is set up to help refugees from Europe come to America, right? Unfortunately, by this point, it's not nearly enough to help the vast majority of Jewish people. The guy who has the most to help is a guy who was the Swedish diplomat to Hungary, and his name was Raoul. I always forget. It's an odd name, Raoul, Swedish guy, and he's like a hero. Raoul Wallenberg, there he is. This fella will say he's kind of, I don't know if you've ever heard of the movie Schindler's List, but he's kind of like Oskar Schindler. He's going to save thousands of Hungarian Jews and get them to the United States by issuing them Swedish documents and passports and stuff. So he's like basically faking that they're Swedish people and they will flee from Hungary to the United States. But I think the number I remember reading was like 150,000 maybe total come to get out of Europe. And you may remember that 7 million will die in the Holocaust. And we'll talk about the Holocaust again, but America doesn't have a very strong role in it. The St. Louis is kind of I think a sad moment where we reject that after Kristallnacht. And then, like I said, it's 5 years into the war before we create the War Refugee Board. But, I think that's more than not doing anything. So anyway, what is ultimately going to be the most challenging thing for Europe, the good guys, is can Britain hold out? So if you're looking at World War II, by this point, Hitler has either taken over all of Europe or is allied with Mussolini and Franco. Franco's officially neutral, but he's a fascist, except for the Soviet Union, right, and Britain. And so the Soviet Union is still at this moment in history, in May of 40, still part of the non-aggression pact. So that means only one country and only one democracy remains in all of Europe. and of course it's Britain. And Hitler wants to do what Napoleon failed to do. You remember, I've got the biography back there. It's a dual biography of Hitler and Napoleon. And he wants to be better than Napoleon. And of course, one of Napoleon's greatest failures was his inability to defeat Britain. You know, he never could defeat the British Navy. So one of the things that Hitler realizes is the only way Britain can be invaded, which is what he wants to do, he calls it Operation Sea Lion, is to get rid of the British Air Force. The problem, though, is you can't land troops if they're like fighters and bombers blowing up your troop carrier. Troop carriers are like slow-moving turtles, you know, across the water. It's the last thing you want to do is get that when you got the ME-109s coming at you. So, nonetheless, what happens is Hitler makes a fateful decision to send bombers to target the airfields and the air bases and refueling bases of the British Air Force, which is called the RAF, the Royal Air Force. Now, those I should probably put a picture of this too. Those locations are in the Midlands to Highlands of Britain, towards the Scottish border. So I'll put up a map for you to get an idea of it. Location of British airfields in WW2 image. Yeah. So if you imagine this, I'll put it in there for you. Maybe. Wow. Super duper big. So the biggest thing that's important for Hitler is to get rid of the stuff that's up here. These are where the refueling stations are, and up beyond. See, London's way down low. You guys know London's like at the very bottom almost. So everything above this dark blue line is like very, very important for Hitler to get rid of, because you know that's the where the fuel depots are, the things that are going to be used to refuel the British planes and things like that. So initially, he would send bombers from France. This is France down here, and they would fly up here with a fighter escort. So that's how that works. So you would send a bomber, bigger than these usually, and then when they got to where the airfields and the fuel tanks were, they dropped their bombs on them. And then these fighter planes would circle around the bombers and attack the British fighter planes who were trying to shoot down the bomber. So the RAF is fighting the German Luftwaffe. That's what this is. Here's a Spitfire. Here's a Hurricane. And so these are the planes attacking the Stuka dive bomber and other types of bombers, right? Or the Junkers 87. So what these fighters would do is they would battle it out often over the English Channel. This is what becomes known as the Battle of Britain, the aerial battle of Britain. And, you know, the bombers would get up here and they would drop their bombs. But the problem was, it's a problem of design. I mean, bombers are slow, but they carry more fuel. So they have a farther range. Fighters are fast and maneuverable, and they exchange that for fuel. So they don't have as much fuel. So if you're a German fighter escorting a bomber, if they are up here and getting shot at, a lot of times they would just turn around and go back because they would run out of gas otherwise. So the target was too far away. And, you know, initially this was having a good impact on the Brits. I mean, a bad impact, but, you know, good from the German perspective. But one of the pilots, rather than bomb an airfield up here, got turned back, and he dropped a bomb on a civilian population in London. He bombs London, and London, well, obviously is the capital. These towns and stuff that they start bombing are not military targets per se, and Hitler is getting impatient, and so he assumes this is better. Let's just bomb what's easier to get to. Keep in mind, most of the airfields ultimately are going to be up past this blue line, right? And so they're just bombing all this stuff. And the irony is that he had a better chance of winning if he had stayed bombing airfields and air bases and fuel. Because once he starts bombing civilians, that means these guys are free to keep fighting, right? And what is interesting to me about this is normally people think you can bomb people into submission. Like if you drop enough bombs, they'll just quit, right? Well, World War II taught us anything. That's not true. Not unless you drop an atom bomb. All right, because they're going to bomb the living daylights out of Britain. They call it the Blitz, and so they blow up every major building. St. Paul's Cathedral survives remarkably. The British people will go into the underground, the subway, at night during the bombings. They would usually bomb at night because if you bomb in the daylight, you can get shot at easier. You can see the target. And Churchill will come on the radio and deliver radio addresses over and over again to the British people about, we will never surrender. We will never give up. We will fight them in the air. We will fight them in land. We will fight them in the sea, but we will never surrender. You know, they made a movie about this called Finest Hour. It was really good, about Churchill's performance here. And one of the things that's really cool is all across Britain, you would see things like keep calm and carry on. This is when this sort of famous image became popularized, was during the Battle of Britain, during the Blitz. So, the British are going to do everything they can to hold out, but it's not enough. It's just nowhere close to enough. And it looks like the Brits are going to lose. Like they're going to get bombed into submission. Keep in mind, Hitler can bomb them around the clock now from the Netherlands and from Belgium and from France. And it looks like they're not going to make it. And so at this point, Churchill has been calling FDR like often. FDR and Churchill are talking regularly. The King and Queen of England come to America and basically ask FDR for assistance. First time in history, the British King comes to us, which was a really historic moment. They meet at Hyde Park up on the Hudson River. This is FDR's home. And he famously invites them to a cookout, right, which they've never been to, and invites them to eat hot dogs. And it's a very famous story about how the King of England doesn't know how to eat a hot dog, has to be instructed on how to. But he gets one and he has mustard on it. And here's the king. It's supposed to be all, dignified. By the way, this king that we're talking about had a serious stutter too. So he was already, so if you've heard of the movie like The King's Speech, that's this king. It's King George V, right? Sixth, excuse me. So he eats the hot dog and FDR is all beaming and happy, and kind of rubbing it in a little bit on the Brits. But what FDR really wants to do is help them. He has a problem though. The American people see direct aid to the Brits as taking us too close to war. So, while this is going on, you have a heated debate in America between Americans about what should we do? What should we do? Because the Brits are fighting. And by the way, CBS was broadcasting radio broadcast to America. Edward R. Murrow, the great newsman, was broadcasting the story of the Blitz with the sound of bombs blowing up above. Like they were down in a bunker and he was on a radio to America. So we could listen at night here in America. We would listen on our radios to the sound of bombings in Britain. So this was going on through our head. And we were like, what do we do? What do we do? And so you had two groups that got into a fairly big argument about this. One group has an enormous name, and I wish it wasn't that long, but it's called the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies. And you can see it's right here, Committee to Defend America and down here, they're encouraging women to buy a pen and to buy a tie lapel or a lapel pin for men to send guns, not sons, right? Like if we help the Brits, then we won't have to go there ourselves. That's the argument. So we should help them, says the CDAAA, Committee to Defend America. Write the president, tell him to help Britain. But there are also, and these fellows right here are the most famous. You have Senator Wheeler's name, Senator Nye's name. By the way, both Nye and Wheeler are from the West. Nye was from North Dakota. Wheeler, I forget where he's from, but somewhere out west. And then you have another figure who is often surprised people, Charles Lindbergh. Now, Lindbergh is an interesting one because sometimes critics of Lindbergh call him a Nazi or a fascist. And you can even see him depicted here, Heil Lindbergh by Dr. Seuss, right? So, the concern is by Lindbergh. Lindbergh has been to Germany. He has seen the Luftwaffe in person. He was a colonel. He was made a colonel in the military and toured all the air bases around the world to kind of see. And he knows what Germany has. Plus, he really is, in his view, an isolationist, loyal American, right? And so he's not a Nazi, but he's much less vehemently opposed to Hitler than some people are. All right, he's not a Nazi sympathizer per se, but nonetheless, he will be the leading advocate, as will Senators Wheeler and Nye, to keep America out of the war and to focus on defending America first. So by that I mean kind of create a fortress America, safe from intervention. So a very isolationist group, America First, wants us to remain neutral. CDAAA, Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies, wants us to help Britain. So The answer for FDR is, as it often is the case, let's make an executive order. So rather than wait for Congress to act, which is, Congress's hands are basically tied. They can embargo Germany, they can declare war. So what FDR does is he's talking to Churchill, whose ships are being sunk by submarines, whose planes are being blown up by German planes. He needs war material, and they've run out of cash. Remember cash and carry? Cash and carry was based on gold money, and they don't have anymore. And so he asked FDR if FDR can do anything. And FDR, who was, remember, in charge of the Navy's acquisitions, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He's very, very knowledgeable about where naval ships are around the world, right? And he says, well, we've got these 50 steamships, from our days of the Great White Fleet. Remember that? They're destroyers. We don't really need them anymore, but they could help you against submarines, right? Why don't we do this? We'll just trade them. You can have those, and we'll get all these cool naval bases for the next 100 years or 99 years. Yeah, well, they're leases. They're not. We don't own the base so much as we get to use the base for 99 years. And this is called the destroyers for bases deal, and then it makes sense. We get a base in Newfoundland, a base in the Bahamas, a base in Jamaica, a base in Guyana, Bermuda. So everywhere the Brits were, basically, we get a naval base there. In exchange, they get 50 destroyers. People howl here in America, oh, you're getting us closer to war. You draw us into war. And that's a legitimate accusation. But FDR does not want to go to war. I want to make that clear. He doesn't want to go to war. He wants Britain to win the war. But it becomes pretty clear to him that, without the Soviet Union, there's no way Britain is going to win the war. Now, they don't know what the Soviet Union is going to do. And that's when, Hitler's going to make probably the greatest mistake of the entire war. That's right. So no destroyers for bases. And then we've already mentioned this election once, so let's mention it again. The election of 1940. So this will be the election that shatters the two-term tradition, right? This is the third election of FDR. And, the issue is, the paramount issue is naturally the third term. Like, obviously, the real issue is World War II, but here's why it's a problem. The real issue is World War II, but if you're a voter, Wilkie has supported everything that FDR has done. Like, Wilkie used to be a Democrat, by the way, until 1939. So he is a liberal or a progressive lawyer who's just recently moved to New York. He's a Wall Street lawyer now, but, he wasn't initially. He changed in 1939. And his criticism, basically, and by the way, he was very, very charming and was a great speaker and lots of energy. And, FDR doesn't really do anything. FDR doesn't campaign or anything. His name is out there. And so Wilkie is going to, basically accuse FDR of dictatorship. Yeah. Court packing happened before this, and running for a third term is a form of, for him, tyranny. Although the thing about Wilkie is it's not a dirty election, really. You know what I mean? He's not attacking FDR's character per se. And then the other thing they run against is just saying they would be more efficient and better at administering help. But this was going to be one of those elections where people did not want to change horses in midstream in the midst of a global crisis. And so that's what happens. And FDR gets reelected comfortably, but he will make a quote that will come back to haunt him. It's very similar to Woodrow Wilson. He says, "We will not send American boys into any foreign wars." That's a pretty clear statement, right? Not send, but we will help our friends and neighbors, he says, with all aid short of war. So he makes a campaign promise that we're going to continue helping the Brits, but we're not going to get in the war. And America, look, again, this is kind of at the time, these are the Republican bastions, the West here and New England. But yeah, pretty comfortable victory, not as big as the victory in 32, of course, or even 36. So this is FDR's very famous speech, right? This is the Lend-Lease speech. All right, yeah, it's a big one, right? And so he's made this promise not to send boys into foreign wars, but to do everything short of it. Now, I love FDR's kind of way of turning a phrase here. He says, I'm just trying to get rid of that silly old dollar sign, right? I'm just going to eliminate the dollar sign. That is something brand new in thoughts of practically everybody in the room, right? We want to get rid of the dollar. So what are you talking about is people in 40, were really that talked about FDR's deficits, the New Deal's cost, how much money would it cost to help European countries. And it's all about cost, right? How much is it going to cost? And what he says is one of the most, I think, interesting analogies, and you should be familiar with it. He says, what happens if my neighbor's house catches on fire and I have a garden hose that's 500 feet away? So like if the middle school had a massive set of like fire hoses and this building caught on fire, right? Like we're relatively close by. If he could take my garden hose and connect it to his hydrant, I may help him put out his fire. Now, what should I do? I don't say to him, neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You'll have to pay me $15 back, right? Right. You don't worry. What is that transaction that goes on? I don't want $15. I just want my garden hose back. All right. If it goes to the fire, all right, intact without any damage, he gives it back to me and thanks me. But suppose it gets smashed up or gets holes in it during the fire. We don't have too much formality about it, but I say to him, I was glad to lend you that hose. I see I can't use it anymore. He says, how many feet of it were there? I tell him there were 150 feet. He says, all right, I will replace it. And I get my garden hose back in good shape. So we're going to loan tanks and airplanes to the British and anybody else who needs it. We're going to loan it to them. Now, the great isolationist senator of this period is the son of President Taft, and his name is Robert Taft or Bob Taft. And Bob Taft gives a very famous response to this. Getting back a used tank is like getting back used chewing gum. Nobody wants to have chewing gum back, right? Like if you loan someone chewing gum, you're not actually loaning it to them, right? So if you loan a tank to someone, it's going to get blown up. If you loan an airplane to someone, they're going to shoot it down or get bullet holes in it and stuff. So this is just basically code, Taft says, for giving them this stuff. And FDR is like, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it, but it's better to loan it to them now than to have nothing and the fire do what? Spread. So that's his whole analogy is not the value of his garden hose, right? It's what happens if fire spreads and he doesn't get to put it out. So this analogy he says well, he gives it during the campaign. He says it during the election, and he also says it on a fireside chat. So you get a whole lot of this garden hose analogy. But he gives another speech that for some reason your book doesn't mention. I would like you to write it down because it's it pops up later, but not in the right place. And this is the State of the Union of 1941. So this is his eighth State of the Union address. Yep. And this one has a distinctive name. It is called in history the Four Freedoms Speech. And he talks about what everyone so it's been a long time since we talked about natural rights, right? Like John Locke and natural rights. But what he says in the world today, everywhere, people should have the following freedom. And he's talking, of course, about the fact that freedom is under assault everywhere. Okay. And he says we should have freedom of speech, right? By the way, the painter here who will make 4 great paintings of these freedoms' name is Norman Rockwell. And I do want you to know that painter's name, Norman Rockwell. This is what's called the Four Freedoms poster. And it actually will be 4 separate posters that will be all over the place. And the first is freedom of speech, they say then. Today here it's called freedom of expression. And I love the picture. It reminds me of my dad when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I would go with my dad to Board of Supervisors meetings, all right, or to government meetings. And when it came time, if dad had an issue that bothered him or concerned him, he would stand up and talk, usually in his work clothes, and people would listen and respect him, because he was a working class, decent guy who was a part of the community. And you should have the right as Americans or Germans or Russians or anybody else to have freedom of speech. That's what FDR says. You should have freedom of worship, freedom of religion, right? Like you should be able, and this is a great painting where you see many of the world's religious practices exhibited by many different people. This one is one that is going to lay really sort of, I think, the association with the New Deal. We should have freedom from want. Now, he doesn't mean freedom from wanting stuff, but freedom from not having enough food, enough shelter. And so this is the idea of sort of an early version of a war on poverty. The idea that everyone should not be suffering, which is very, very much in the reign of FDR's kind of mindset. And then lastly, freedom from fear. This fella here is holding a newspaper that's talking about towns being bombed in Britain, right? And so they're, children, by the way, in Britain, if you've ever read the Narnia series, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the reason why the Pevensey kids are in that wardrobe is because they've been sent to the countryside to an uncle's estate to get away from the city that's being bombed. All right, so they're there during the Battle of Britain. If you've ever seen the Peter Pan story of the Darling family, they escaped to Never Never Land during the bombing of Britain, right? So a lot of children are being evacuated from the cities during this period, and that's what this is. So this is FDR's Four Freedom speech. I definitely want you to be familiar with it and know what he was talking about. Okay, so the thing that's interesting to me about Lend-Lease, and that's this sort of epochal bill, is that unlike destroyers for bases or cash and carry, this is debated for months by the American people. This is debated not only by Congress, but like in lunch counters and in restaurants and in stores. People are having a conversation like, what should we do? And in the end, this bill overwhelmingly passes. It's Bill 1776. That's not a coincidence, right? And it is called in history the Lend-Lease Act. And it guarantees that we will provide weapons and arms and planes and tanks and trucks to the Allies to stop the aggressors. So I have a question on here. What then is the result of this? Well, the result of this is, of course, $50 billion to the Allies, right? 50 billion. Now we're really the arsenal of democracy. So if you look at this plane, this aircraft carrier here, you'll see these are planes with their wings up with RAF circles on, the wings of RAF, but they were manufactured in America. So you'll see Spitfire is actually made in America. And it is going to be an enormous sum of money, 50 billion. Now remember, the entire New Deal cost 20 billion, all right? And so here is a law that says we're going to spend $50 billion this year. So that's a huge ramp up in a very short amount of time. And the results of this are pretty clear. After the isolationists and internationalists had their argument, after Taft and Wheeler have it out with FDR's people, the American public chooses. Like they contact their congressman, they say we want to help Britain. All efforts short of war, right? But it is pretty clear we're not neutral anymore. It's not called the Neutrality Act of 1941. It is not neutral. We are only helping countries that are being attacked. This is an overt challenge to Nazi Germany. And with that, our machinery starts gearing up to make everything necessary for war. So this will be the moment in 1941. Now, we'd started sort of already with cash and carry back in 39. So we started building war stuff, war production all the way back here somewhere. Cash and carry. Nope, still, there it is. So we've been neutral, sort of, but now it is pretty clear we're not neutral anymore, okay? And this is where you're going to see. Now, the draft has already started before we're in the war, right? You'll notice the date August. August ain't December, and we already have 1.5 million people in the Army from the previous number of 264. And then after December, we're just going to see a massive expansion. So by the end of World War II, we will have 8.3 million men, mostly men, a few women, in uniform, in combat uniform, like in the battlefronts, so to speak, all around Europe and Asia. So this is a rapid change. So just imagine going from summer 40, 264,000 to 8 million in 5 years. So that's a major change. And you should be aware of that. That's one of the things that Lend-Lease does, is it says it's time to really ramp up ourself. And so what happens is inevitable because it's what happened in World War I. We're sending merchant ships to Britain by the ton, right? By the thousands of tons. And what was bound to happen eventually was German subs would sink one, right? We were sailing into a war zone. And so the Germans sink a ship called the Robin Moor without warning. I mean, sinking it without warning. But the lesson of it is, and this is FDR's language, I should quote this here. FDR says, we must take the sinking of the Robin Moor as a warning to not resist the Nazis. That's what they're trying to tell us. Don't resist us. It's a warning that we may use the high seas only with the Nazis' permission. Were we to yield on this, we would submit to the world domination at the hands of the leaders of the German Reich. We are not yielding, and we do not propose to yield. So with this, he will then begin, as he kind of does, convoying ships. So you're going to have American warships sailing along Lend-Lease ships. So the ships carrying the planes and tanks are going to have destroyers sailing beside them.
That way, if we get attacked,
They'll have an American defense. That's right. And so that means we're not directly at war, but we're just about. And then Hitler does something stupid. All right. Now, Hitler, had already had a deal with the Soviets, right? But he wanted to take control over territory down here around the Black Sea. And he talked about it with the Soviets, and they were like, no, I don't think so. The Black Sea's kind of their domain, they claim. Keep in mind, this is where they fought multiple wars, Crimea and stuff like that. And so with that, Hitler makes his plan. Now, the problem for Hitler is the couple. Now, he has three major groups. You see these three army groups right here, North, Center, and South. And he has three targets that if he can take them out, he believes that the Soviets will lose. He'll take out their industrial heartland. It'll pretty much get rid of all their cities and stuff like that. So he's intending to go to, as you can see the big arrow here, Leningrad, which was the old St. Petersburg, Moscow, which is here, furthest into the interior in the middle, and then down through the Caucasus to what will ultimately be Iran. That's his target, is to get to Persia, is to get to Iraq. But on the way, he'll knock out any major Soviet cities, including the most important city on the Volga and Don River, Stalingrad. So he's got like three targets. This is a mistake. Strategically, it was a bad idea. It would have been much smarter, I think, to have brought all three armies together and attacked from the north and then rolled southward, rather than dividing his forces. But that's not his major problem initially. Initially, his big problem is the Italians are getting their rear ends handed to them in Yugoslavia. You're like, what? He has to divert forces. They were going to launch Operation Barbarossa in May of 41, right? Because he knows what's coming. He knows if you're in Russia in the wintertime, that ain't good. Yeah. All right. And so he wants to launch it so that he's going through Lithuania and he's going through Ukraine in these summer months, right? But Mussolini needs help overcoming the partisans in Yugoslavia. So he has to divert it's like 3 divisions down into the Balkans. So by the time they get their act together, it's a little bit later, June. And that's going to catch up with him because by the time they get here, and again, initially, I told you the other day, Stalin had killed off like a third plus of the Russian high command. A lot of the key generals are dead. And when Hitler does this, Stalin locks himself in his room for a week. Doesn't even come out of the room. Like he has like a nervous breakdown, basically. And the Nazis, the Germans, just launch a massive offensive and roll up the Russian military like it's nothing. The Russians are retreating. They're not even able to do scorched earth so much. They're just like falling backwards. And so by January of 42, which is just 6 months, this is how far the German army is. They're on the banks or on the verge of taking all 3 cities in 6 months. So if you're at home, like over here in America, you're like, oh my gosh, this guy has got Britain on its knees and is about to defeat the Soviet Union. He's going to control all of Europe. Like all of Europe, and nobody's ever done that. I mean, like literally all of Europe, including Russia. So it looks like things are going his way, right? Then amidst this, so here's the date, August. You can see August is in this. The Battle of Britain has worn down. I do want to mention one other thing about the Battle of Britain. There will be, I think it's like a dozen or so Americans who join the British Air Force as Americans. Like they go over and they create a unit of airplane pilots, fighter pilots, and it's kind of depicted in the film Pearl Harbor, Ben Affleck's character. But that actually happens. Americans will go who want to fight the Germans. And one of those guys is from here, from Pennsylvania County. All right. And he'll be one of the most decorated Americans in history. At one time, he had the Guinness record for decorations. His name is Clyde East, and he'll leave Pittsylvania County as a 17-year-old and enlist in the Canadian military. He'll go up to the Canadian Army, join it as a pilot, and then go over and fight in the Battle of Britain, and then fight on D-Day as an American pilot. You know, like, he doesn't quit being an American. He just goes over to Canada and joins their army to go fight in Britain. Yeah, well, I don't even think he changed his citizenship. He's just like a volunteer, you know. So there will be Americans who help the Brits, you know, I don't want to say illegally, but not officially, you know, in that respect. Kind of like the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. So amidst all of this, FDR has a summer retreat place up in Canada, up near Newfoundland. And he invites Winston Churchill to Canada secretly. Now, some people get wind of it, but it's not a publicized meeting at the time. And they're going to meet on his yacht up there in Newfoundland. And they're going to hash out an agreement for what Europe and the world will look like after World War II. Now, when I say that, you should be kind of like, what? First of all, America is not in World War II. No. And at the time, Britain wasn't really winning World War II. And so here's Churchill and Roosevelt sitting down together, planning what the post-war world will look like. You know, talk about the nerve. These guys are awesome. So they agree on what becomes known as the Atlantic Charter. So this is the Atlantic Conference, right? And this becomes known as the Atlantic Charter. Now, I will tell you this. There's no major selling of this thing to the American people. There's no Committee of Public Information. There's no propaganda. Most Americans couldn't tell you anything on this thing. But from FDR and Churchill, this is their plan. This is what they want to do, what they want to accomplish. So they will not be fighting for any territory. And that's a big deal because the UK was infamous, especially, by the way, guys, Churchill was an imperialist. You know, he came from the age of imperialism. So no more, you know, no more of that. We will adjust territories based on the people there. Now, that's straight up self-determination, right? They're going to have no tariffs or low tariffs, global cooperation, freedom from, here's the four freedoms, right? Disarmament and the defeat of the Germans. So without us even being in World War II, Hitler, without fighting Hitler officially, kind of unofficially, we make a plan for what we'll do after we win World War II. This is awesome. Cocky America, right? So as expected, you know, the submarines are going to start attacking. The U-boats are going to start attacking American ships. The first ship is the Greer. It is not severely damaged at all. It gets hit, but it just kind of like is a metal injury. It doesn't penetrate. It's not a penetrating wound, so to speak, not an explosion. The next is the Carney, and it actually does have a hole in it. If you can see right here, there's a torpedo that blows a hole in the side of it. All right, and it gets towed. This is, I think, on the way. I forget who's towing it. Right, it's months. I don't know. I can't read it. But it's being towed at that point. 11 Americans were killed, and FDR knew that would happen, and he kind of explained that to the American people that this could lead to death. You know, escorting Lend-Lease. And then here is the ship before it was sunk, obviously, when it was on the Hudson River, and it was attacked and it sank. And everyone just about on board died. All the officers died. You know, it was a terrible blow. And at this point, you would think, isn't this a casus belli? Right? You remember what that means? Calls for war, casus belli. Like they've attacked our ships repeatedly. But no, we're not still at war with Hitler officially yet. And I think there were people in America who thought that this would lead us into war and still didn't. But that brings us to another location, which we shouldn't forget about, and that is on the other ocean. So the Japanese, since really 31, have been aggressively attacking places in Asia, first Korea, then Manchuria, then the rest of China. We recall that President Hoover and his Secretary of State had issued something called the Stimson Doctrine, saying we wouldn't recognize it, but that didn't really stop them. Then later on, President Roosevelt said the quarantine speech, which meant like not only would we not recognize it, but we would publicly disagree with the expansion policy, like any place. But neither of those things have any real oomph to them. So in the world of diplomacy, I should go ahead and teach all this year, there's an expression for how diplomats operate. You have what are called carrots and sticks. And it's an analogy for getting a mule to plow a field. If you offer a mule a carrot by like dangling it in front of it, the mule will try to reach that carrot. So it's a sort of enticement. It's a way to sort of motivate someone to do something for you. So we call that in policy soft foreign policy. Diplomacy is soft foreign policy, meaning negotiation, meaning enticing you with some kind of awesome option, like, here's a trade deal. Then you have what is called hard diplomacy. And of course, the hardest kinds of diplomacy of all is warfare. Like if we drop a bomb on you or attack you, that's hard. That's hard policy. It's not diplomacy anymore. But the other way to do that is boycott or embargo. An embargo is one step removed from warfare. And so that's what we do. We embargo the Japanese. First, we ban any types of material to be shipped to Japan that could be used for warfare. So airplane parts, gas, oil, scrap iron, anything that can be used to assemble an airplane or a ship, we don't sell them anymore. We stop selling them. We embargo them. And then we cut off all oil. So by August, we have reached the version of the hardest policy you can do short of war. We're not trading with Japan. The Japanese, after this happens, send diplomats to America, the Japanese ambassadors. And on December 6th, those ambassadors are negotiating with President Roosevelt and the White House on how to get this ended. Knowing full well, they planned months in advance. Admiral Yamamoto, who was the commander of the Japanese Navy, will later shoot this guy down. Yamamoto has made a plan. Now, he had trained in America with the U.S. Navy, and he knew America very well. Like, he'd been here for several years. A lot of Japanese high command officers trained in America after Matthew Perry. And he has come up with a plan on how to knock the American fleet out of the Pacific before the fight even starts. The Japanese did that back in 1904 to the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. They attacked them without warning, surprising them. So his plan is to bring an entire fleet of aircraft carriers to our naval base at Hawaii, launch a surprise attack, and sink our entire heavy Navy, our major ships. And he's developed, so by the way, this is Pearl Harbor from the sky. This is a Japanese picture taken that day. We have in the harbor a large island, right? It's called Ford Island, right in the middle. And this is where the 5 major U.S. battleships were located that get sunk. All right. These are the big battleships that were together here in what is called Battleship Row. All right. And this harbor is actually quite shallow. So it has to be dredged. The sand and stuff has to be dug up out of it. And so the Japanese throughout this whole area, as well as back in Honolulu and other places, have spies. And they've taken pictures of all of the ships. And every Japanese pilot has a primary target and a secondary target to attack on that day. I told you that the harbor is shallow. They've dredged up the sand. So the Japanese invent a special propeller for their torpedoes so that the torpedo won't go deep in the water. It'll hit the water and stay shallow, right? They've had to invent that just to attack us, okay? And that day, they send their attack actually from the north side of the island. I don't have a picture of the map here. I mean, I should, but they actually launch their plane from the north of the island. Like the planes come around from the top of the island and come over the island. So the guys that are using radar at the time were like, this looks like a big fleet of airplanes coming in or something, and they're like, hey, maybe it's bombers. We don't know, like they're always having communication errors, but it looked like it was coming from America. Like the direction was from the east, of the island. And so it was a Sunday morning. If you know anything about about Navy guys, Saturday night's a night party. All right. So everybody was hungover, sleeping in, didn't have to have anywhere, didn't have to be anywhere. And so they were literally not at any level of alert when the first bombs hit. So the first bombs, now they should have been an alert because we caught a Japanese sub right here. A submarine had come into the harbor, which is an act of war. If an enemy sub shows up in your naval base, that's bad. The commander of the fleet didn't get notification of that until the planes were in the air. So we missed an opportunity there. President Roosevelt and the Navy intelligence believed the attack would come in the Philippines. They thought that's where the Japanese would attack us. They didn't think the Japanese fleet could sail all the way to America undetected. But the Pacific Ocean's a big body of water, and it did. It got all the way here undetected. There is a bit of serendipity. If there was any good luck that day, there are no aircraft carriers in this picture. Yep, the 3 carriers that would have been stationed there were on a mission, a training mission. It's not a conspiracy theory. It just happened, and when the Japanese bomb the harbor, it is a devastating impact. They will have 3 launched attacks. The first one is complete success. The second one is a complete success. The third one is actually stopped by American pilots and Navy planes or Air Force planes. Okay, so they'll target on the first attack the main harbor itself, which is Battleship Row. And this is called Hickam Field. I don't know if you can see it down here, but it's an airplane field, the Army Air Base. And they have a spectacular success at that. They sink 5 of our ships almost instantly. Or if they don't sink, they're sitting in the harbor, like in the sand. Okay. And they blow up the airfield at most of the air at Hickam Field. They come back. Their second wave targets the military base. So they target naval bases, naval fueling, stuff like that. So naval stuff. The Navy hospital. The third attack was going to be to target civilians. So the deaths could have been much higher than the 3,000 Americans killed that day. But nonetheless, this is an absolute disaster. They obliterate the American fleet. That's the Arizona. The Arizona will be hit in its mid deck, and it will go. Back then, the ships had wooden decks. Even the aircraft carriers had wooden decks, and the bomb will go through the deck and land in the powder magazine of the battleship, which is where the gunpowder, the big shells are. And so guys that survived Pearl Harbor say when the Arizona exploded, and you're talking about thousands of tons of steel, right? When this thing exploded, it shook the island because the whole ship blew up. And you're talking about a battleship. You're not talking about a small vessel here. So the ship blew up in half. Here you can see fires from the attack on the naval base. That is a picture of the Arizona from today. The Arizona is today underwater. Man, that ended up being darker than I remember. But that's if you go out to Pearl Harbor today as an American, this is the Pearl Harbor Memorial, and the ship is a tomb. All the Americans, and it's close to 1,000 of them that were killed in the Arizona, are still in that. This is where they're buried, and so this is the only ship that stayed underwater after the bombings. All the other ships we're going to dig up, so to speak, and repair, and they'll be used later against the Japanese. But Arizona was so badly damaged, and there were so many people in it, they chose to make that a permanent burial place for these naval personnel. So, yeah, here you can see an aircraft carrier in Pearl Harbor today, well, recently. And what will happen, of course, is President Roosevelt will come on the radio. Interestingly enough, the very first person from the Roosevelt administration to address the public is Eleanor Roosevelt. She was actually on the way to give a speech when she was notified about the event. And so she'll tell an audience that this has happened. And then the radio will tell the public, and then FDR will come on and say, yesterday, December 7th, the date which will live in infamy, the very famous speech. And in less than 24 hours from the attack, Congress will have passed articles of war on Japan. And yeah, it's only a handful of people, including Jeanette Rankin, who don't, or maybe I'm not sure she's the only one, but it's very few people. And so here you can see FDR wearing a black armband. And obviously the thing about Pearl Harbor, and this is such an important result, no one hardly at all is isolationist after this. Even Robert Taft, the great isolationist, is not isolationist anymore. We got to go kick their butt. Now, what's interesting to me about the way World War II commences for our class is that even though what brought us into the war was the attack by the Japanese, right? Even though this is what causes us to go to war, our strategy from the very beginning is going to be called Get Hitler First. Because if you understand, the Japanese are a long ways away from America, right? And they're not an overt threat to our national security internally, overall, although we'll talk about the internment of Japanese Americans. If Britain or Russia were to lose, or if both were to lose, then we would have to fight all the Axis powers alone. So our objective is to sort of knock the Nazis out so that we can liberate France and have Britain help us. So we can, in other words, we can have a bigger team. And a lot of Americans are confused by that. They're like, well, Hitler didn't bomb us at Pearl Harbor. But, FDR is going to explain it. So I didn't wear my Pearl Harbor shirt today. I, for some reason, forgot to. But after this, no more concern about, getting dragged into war. We're now in it, and we'll be in it to win it, so to speak. And so after spring break, we'll come back and talk about America's strategy to win World War II, but also how life on the home front of the United States changes dramatically, like how different America will be during World War II, even from what we were used to with the New Deal. Like this is way more than just what the New Deal was. So I'm going to stop with that, and I hope you learned something from that.